The Ace Combat series is one of Namco's longest-running 3D franchises, having first released back in 1995 on Sony PlayStation. Now, after lying dormant for the past several years, Ace Combat has returned. And thankfully, it goes back to the series' roots. Following a series of misfires last generation with games like Ace Combat Assault Horizon, Ace Combat Infinity, that free-to-play PS3 game, and various other middling iterations, it's great to see a proper sequel. Ace Combat 7 has plenty of new features on hand, but really, it's the classic Ace Combat mission design and gameplay which I love the most. Ace Combat 7 also marks the first time a numbered sequel has launched across multiple platforms without relying on an in-house Namco-developed engine. That's right, this is an Unreal Engine 4 title. Today then, we're going to chart the evolution of the mainline series, examine the presentation and design of Ace Combat 7 itself, while comparing every version of the game. So, strap in because we're entering the danger zone. When you first take to the skies in Ace Combat 7, you may experience an unfamiliar feeling. Unless you're into hardcore simulators, there aren't a lot of flight combat games being released these days, especially on consoles. But there was a time when flight sims stood as an industry juggernaut, a genre made popular primarily on the PC during the late 80s and 90s. During this era, gamers were treated to a wide variety of titles ranging from hardcore simulations to more arcadey experiences. If you were a console player, however, there wasn't a lot on offer. But thanks to new 3D capable machines like the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation, suddenly it was possible to take to the skies in full 3D on a low-cost console. And Namco was one of the first to deliver on this promise. Known as Air Combat in the Western world, the original Ace Combat introduced console players to a new style of game, you could say, the flight sim. At its core, the Ace Combat series revolves around the joy of flight combat, and that fun factor has existed since the very first game. It's not really a simulation, mind you, but it does offer an exhilarating, arcadey take on the concept with just enough realism. Namco also released an arcade game in 1995 known as Air Combat 22. It's much faster paced and more arcadey than the console release, but it looks amazing for its time and runs at a smooth 60 frames per second. These two games form the origins of the Ace Combat series. This was followed up 2 years later in 1997 with Ace Combat 2. By this point, the developers had a much tighter grasp on the hardware, and the visuals were dramatically more impressive as a result. The world is more detailed, fully textured, and larger in scope. Plane models are more complex, and shading is improved across the board. Mission variety is ramped up too, while the game itself is more ambitious overall. Fundamentally, this is the game that would establish key elements that would persist going forward in the series. This includes the animated mission briefings, the debriefing segments where lines are used to illustrate your movements during the previous mission, a full post-mission replay system, and a new HUD and map system that would serve as a model for many similar games going forward. This was followed up by Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere, which was released 2 years later in Japan with a significantly more ambitious overall design. Shipping on 2 discs, this is the first game in the series to focus heavily on a narrative, with plenty of animated cutscenes and voiced sections between each mission. It features branching mission paths while introducing expanded radio chatter into the gameplay. The visuals also receive a significant boost with gorgeous color schemes reminiscent of Ridge Racer Type 4, hugely improved model quality, better effects such as motion blur, and moving clouds, not to mention an attempt at simulating specular highlights across bodies of water. It's faked using a texture beneath the surface, but it's cool to see on the original PlayStation. With its new sci-fi setting, hugely improved presentation, and branching mission design, it set a new standard for the series, but unfortunately, this isn't the version most people played. When brought to the West, most of these features were stripped out. The same core gameplay is there, but the story, dialogue, and branching mission design were all eliminated, and the game was reduced to a single disc. 1 year after the Western release of AC3, Ace Combat 4 Shattered Skies made its debut on PlayStation 2. This is my personal favorite installment in the series thus far, thanks to its remarkable presentation, excellent handling, larger scale theaters of war, and unique storytelling. As a PS2 game, Namco pushes a lot of new visual techniques here, including depth of field, heat waves, detailed plane and environment models, along with advanced particle effects. Running at 60 frames per second and supporting 16:9 widescreen, the game feels buttery smooth to play, holding up brilliantly to this day. The weight and handling of each plane feels remarkably satisfying, while the mission design is more open-ended, with huge maps designed to allow players to approach objectives in a more free-form manner. AC4 is the game which first introduced the concept of Strange Reel then, the fictional Ace Combat universe, in addition to the very analog presentation with lots of flickering, reflective monitors and rolling bars, which we still kind of see today. This was then followed up by Ace Combat 5, The Unsung War, which happens to be included as a pre-order bonus for Ace Combat 7 on PlayStation 4, and that's the version we're looking at here today. AC5 went all in on the narrative angle, while including more varied missions and plenty of cinematic moments. It's a huge game with a fantastic musical score. It was also directed by Kazutoki Kono, a lead producer on Ace Combat 7. This PS4 version of the game is interesting then, as first impressions suggest that it's emulated a la PS2 classics on PS4, but there is evidence that this might be a proper port instead. Unlike PS2 classics, there's no PlayStation 2 boot up logo when you start the game. The widescreen mode functions slightly differently than on PS2, and the file size of this version is 17 gigabytes versus the 3 gigabytes or so of the PS2 original. There's no mention of the PS2 memory cards during saving either, and HUD elements during gameplay are much sharper. Maybe they're just vectors rather than bitmaps, but when emulating the game on PC, the HUD remains blurry and low res, so perhaps not. The in-game graphics are also rendered at a much higher resolution, though I'm not sure that works super well in this game as it reveals the low-res nature of the assets. I think it looks better on a CRT. Still, it's an interesting bonus and a cool way to replay the game, and hopefully it'll be made available separately, as it's still worth playing today. And while opinions are somewhat divisive, Ace Combat 5 is often considered one of the best in the series. And it's a series that would continue from there, with mixed results. Ace Combat 0 and Ace Combat 6 are great games, but many of the spin-offs fell a little flat. Thankfully, things seem to be back on track. Ace Combat 7 marks the return of the series, with all new visuals, missions, and modes, but its connection to the past is key to its success. Essentially, the core game design feels like an evolution and combination of Ace Combat 4 and 5. It also takes place once again in Strange Reel World, with a story that takes place after the events of Ace Combat 5. It's a true follow-up to those games without trying to become something the series was never intended to be. Like the fifth game, AC7 features a lot of variety in its mission types, with everything from dogfights, ground sieges, stealth missions, boss battles, and more, while also offering larger areas and plenty of score-based stages like Ace Combat 4. So the base design of the game is very much in the mold of these classics, but the variety and quality of the action has improved. Controls, handling, and camera work all feel more refined, and missions are extremely varied and enjoyable to replay for high scores. From the DF perspective then, what's most curious is the shift in technology. Ace Combat 7 makes the jump to Unreal Engine 4, just like Tekken 7 and Soul Calibur 6 before it. But this is a more ambitious game with larger environments, lots of destruction, and more on-screen entities. For this new game, the developers have built everything from scratch. All new plane models, new scenery, and a lot of new visual features are on display. The menu system retains the lo-fi aesthetic first defined in Ace Combat 4, and despite the move to a new engine, moving between menus and missions remains extremely fast and fluid. Loading times are never an issue. The move to current generation machines enables a wide range of new visual effects as well, some of which have a direct impact on the gameplay. Perhaps the most impressive addition is the introduction of volumetric cloud cover. Such systems have become increasingly common this generation, but most games with this feature tend to be ground-based. Ace Combat 7, however, has players diving in and out of cloud cover. These clouds appear as thick volumes which you can fly through, which also parallax beautifully with the ground below. They are impacted by light, such as that from the sun, and ice and rain are taken into consideration as well. Fly through a particularly dark cloud and your visibility is reduced significantly, which is key as this feature is also used for gameplay purposes. It's more difficult to lock onto or see your enemies through the clouds. You can hide from radar detection in certain missions, and inclement weather can impact your handling. This is the first time in series history that cloud cover truly plays a significant role in mission design, and it's brilliant. Along those same lines, Ace Combat 7 introduces weather which can impact your flight performance. In one mission, while flying through some rather tight spaces, strong bursts of wind can throw your plane off course, while later, blasts of lightning can temporarily interrupt your instruments, forcing you to fly blind. These weather patterns are represented with a series of beautiful effects. Rain particles fill the screen at points as you fly through the clouds, while globules of water collect on your view screen realistically. Heatwave effects return as well, often visible around the plane's exhaust port or across the ground during takeoff, while vapor trails are visible across the sky with thick, beautiful particle rendering, something which also applies to the explosions. Other cinematic effects include a subtle film grain utilized to increase the sense of realism, in addition to depth of field, featuring a uniquely grainy appearance designed to give the impression of being shot with a camera using a high ISO setting. A subtle motion blur is also applied throughout, though it's kept to minimum during gameplay in order to reduce blur during rotation. You will notice it when planes fly near the camera frustum, and it's ramped up during real-time cutscenes. During flight, a dynamic camera system is used to enhance the action as well. When playing with the expert control option, which is really just the standard for the series, the camera feels more natural than previous games, especially in third person, while the standard option, which provides a more arcade-like experience, features a very dramatic camera movement. This option was introduced in Ace Combat 5, but it feels a lot better here. Terrain is beautifully textured, and materials now appear physically based, lending the whole thing a more realistic appearance. Object density is improved throughout, though regrettably pop-in is visible across all platforms during flight, something especially evident when flying above forested areas or dense urban environments. All of this is designed to operate at 60 frames per second, just like those PS2 installments. A breath of fresh air after the last generation of Ace Combat games targeted 30 FPS instead. Everything just feels cohesive and beautifully crafted. From the UI, the visuals, and even the storytelling, it's all reminiscent of Namco's best work during the early to mid 2000s. It's a tremendous production all around, and it feels great for them to be back. But not everything is perfect. It should be clear by now that Ace Combat 7 is a gorgeous game, but this is also the first time a mainline numbered entry has launched simultaneously across multiple platforms. Yes, Assault Horizon was multi-platform, but AC7 is launching for both base and upgraded consoles in addition to the PC. So what's the story here then? Well, first there's resolution, and this is where the results are a tad disappointing. At the bottom of the pile is the regular old Xbox One, which runs at just 720p. Not uncommon with Unreal Engine 4 on the system, but still disappointing. The game is noticeably blurrier than the other versions, and that includes the HUD and text elements, which all scale with rendering resolution. Next up is the base PS4, which was challenging to pixel count, but I think we're looking at a resolution of 972p, or at least right around there. It's also disappointing, but kind of in line with other Unreal Engine games running on the PS4. I should note that while I've counted a lot of shots across all 4 platforms and found that the resolution numbers were consistent, there's always a small chance that a dynamic resolution is at play, but I don't think that's the case here. Either way, the results on Xbox One and PS4 aren't that great. Unfortunately, these results spell trouble for Xbox One X and PS4 Pro, both of which top out at 1080p. The results are noticeably sharper than the other consoles, so it's definitely an improvement, but I'd have liked to see higher resolutions on both machines, especially Xbox One X, which surely could have mustered 1440p here. It is a beautiful game across all machines, and Unreal Engine 4's AA solution helps minimize aliasing, but it's definitely not as clean as I'd have liked. Resolution is one of the game's weak points. But aside from that, all versions look mostly identical. Volumetric clouds do appear slightly lower resolution on Xbox One S, but other than that, they're basically the same. Thankfully, Ace Combat 7 is also available on the PC, enabling resolutions beyond 1080p with additional options. It looks dramatically better, no doubt, but it's not perfect. Out of the box, it only supports 16:9 output, which means there's no ultra-wide support here. As an Unreal Engine title though, I'd imagine it's only a matter of time before someone solves this problem, but it's still disappointing. The PC version also features a robust options menu, allowing for plenty of scalability in addition to support for frame rates above 60 frames per second, so you can achieve higher resolutions at higher frame rates on a powerful rig. It is disappointing that FXAA is the only anti-aliasing option here, but I'm not sure Unreal Engine's TAA is a good fit for this type of game with such a long draw distance, and of course MSAA is off the table. Still, there are other solutions. I must admit though, the game is gorgeous when running at native 4K on a large screen. This video is 1080p however, but if we zoom in to match the pixel resolution, you can appreciate just how much more detail is present in the scene. It's a very sharp game on PC. My only complaint here is that most of the HUD elements are rendered at 1080p, thus appears somewhat blurry. That said, while the options menu has plenty of tweakables, it really isn't possible to push detail levels beyond the consoles in any meaningful way. Pop-in is still an issue, for instance, but still, overall, it's a decent PC release, even if not quite perfect. The real point of differentiation here, however, lies in performance. This is consistent with what the game's producer Kono has explained in the past, and it's quite accurate. There's a huge disparity in performance between all three versions. So what's the score? Well, let's run through a couple different scenarios here on each console to get a better idea of how the game runs, starting with the second mission. This area, set above rolling hills on a misty day, is not particularly demanding, and here on PS4 Pro we get a completely locked 60 frames per second. It's buttery smooth, exactly as it should be. When the game was first announced, this is the result I was hoping for. Now jumping over to Xbox One X, we see exactly the same thing. This time we're dogfighting in the skies, but it's a locked 60 frames per second just like the Pro. Both versions feel very fluid to play, just like the PlayStation 2 games. I feel that hitting 60 frames per second is very important to the series, so it's nice to see it return. That is, provided you're playing on one of these two machines. You see, over on the base PlayStation 4, the results are not nearly as impressive. The frame rate hovers below 60 FPS much of the time, leading to noticeable judder that is somewhat distracting. It is always playable, of course, but it just feels slightly sluggish. That said, it is a massive improvement over the E3 build I examined back in 2017. Of course, that was a long time ago, so you expect an evolution, but it's still nice to see. Then we come to Xbox One S, and this is not good. The average frame rate is lower than the base PS4 by a fair margin, with surprisingly noticeable dips throughout. It never feels as fast or fluid as it should, often to the point of distraction. The game just cannot hold its target at any point during the mission. It actually feels more like the E3 build I played a year and a half ago. Sadly, this means regular Xbox One and S owners are presented with the lowest resolution and performance. Let's jump over to another mission then, this time a bombing run over a small port. On the PS4 Pro, the frame rate once again holds 60 frames per second, at least most of the time. You see, when flying over this central area, the performance dips slightly, leading to mild judder. This is 7 or 8 missions into the game, I should note, and it was the first time that I encountered any slowdown at all on the Pro. Every single other mission up to this point was 100% locked at 60 frames per second. Over on Xbox One X though, the results are somewhat disappointing. Performance is slower than the PS4 Pro. To me, this doesn't make a lot of sense. The hardware is faster than the Pro, and as such, it should offer performance superior to Sony's machine when operating at the same resolution. It's baffling. It's still overwhelmingly smooth, of course, but I can't help but feel somewhat disappointed. Now's a good point to mention an important factor here. Before running each of these tests, I restarted the game. The reason? I discovered that sleep mode can cause performance issues. Case in point, I was playing the game on PS4 Pro and came across this mission, which ran like this. The performance was significantly worse compared to each mission I've played prior. Now, up until this point, I had been using the system's sleep mode while playing the game during a normal campaign run. However, on a whim, I decided to close the game and restart it, and when I went back to this exact same mission, well, these were the results. The performance is much smoother and almost a locked 60 FPS with a rare dip here or there. It's not something that rears its head often, but I did notice it a couple of times across the different platforms, so I'd recommend restarting the game when playing it, even though technically the system OS should be handling these functions. It's a weird thing, but it's worth noting. Now, if we jump back to performance testing, due to how my accounts are set up on the PS4, I was not able to easily share saves with the base system, and thus I didn't have time to reach that bombing run on that system. But based on performance in earlier missions, it's safe to say that base PS4 performance sits somewhere between Xbox One S and the higher performance consoles, with an average frame rate often in the 50s, though in quieter missions it does get close to 60. Lastly, there's Xbox One S, and it's kind of a disaster. The performance drops right from the start of the mission, and it just keeps getting worse, flying dangerously close to 30 frames per second when crossing over the port. It's fair to say at this point that if you're playing on an Xbox One or an Xbox One S, I can only recommend this version if you're not sensitive to highly variable frame rates. So in summary, here's what you can basically expect. PS4 Pro delivers a near locked 60 frames per second in most scenarios. This is where I've played the game the most, and it's very, very stable. Xbox One X gets close as well, but it does dip slightly in areas where the Pro does not. Sections like this, which are locked on the Pro, drop a little bit on Xbox One X. The base PS4 then is noticeably slower than either of them, with performance averaging in the 50s, though it is a lot better than the E3 build, while Xbox One S regularly dips to nearly 30 FPS in the busiest of scenes. Now, I've given this some thought, and I wonder if some of the differences here are due to optimization for PSVR. Yes, the PSVR mode is impressive, and a lot of fun. It's not the full game, indeed it's just 3 missions, but it's a great bonus mode. It also demands a locked frame rate, thus, even with some of the visual downgrades in that mode, I'd imagine a lot of work was poured into optimization on PlayStation 4 just to ensure smooth VR performance at all times. Perhaps this has spilled over to the main game, which is why we're seeing slightly better performance on the Pro versus the X. Or perhaps they just didn't give the Xbox version the love it deserves. Still, this VR mode really is a lot of fun. The immersion is high, and it feels absolutely amazing to soar through the skies in virtual reality. It really gave me that feeling of riding a roller coaster, but without any significant motion sickness. This one will push your stomach though, so if you are sensitive to these things, be warned. What I also appreciate about this release is that you reprise the role of Mobius 1 from Ace Combat 04, and even start out in the hangar from that game. And there's even more to that. It's a fun throwback in many ways. What I really like about this mode though is how it allows you to appreciate the fine details in the cockpit. The micro abrasions on the cockpit glass glisten realistically in the sun, for instance, while all the little controls within the cockpit are fully modeled and feel especially realistic thanks to the new material system. Plus, being able to track your enemies with your head feels great. It is very immersive. It's just a shame that this mode is not available for PC owners. I'd love to play with the higher resolution Oculus Rift, for instance, but alas, it's not an option. At least the PC version does seem to run quite well overall. While I'm running a more powerful than average rig with a GTX Titan XP, 32 gigs of DDR4 RAM, and an i9-7900X, I was able to max out detail levels at a native 4K while holding 60 FPS with ease. I was also able to run at 3840 by 1600 at 75 frames per second on my ultra-wide PC monitor. I did run into a few dips though at 1 or 2 points that seemed to be related to disk access, and installing to an SSD cleared that right up. So that's performance of Ace Combat 7 in a nutshell. One of the most important elements that we have yet to mention then is audio. Ace Combat 7 sounds phenomenal. The sound effects are certainly great, and the radio chatter adds a lot to the experience, but it's the musical score and mixing that really sell it. One example is the way the soundscape subtly alters as you weave in and out of clouds to dramatic effect.
Asking for another round. All escorts form up for another attack. Point is 835.
But it's the soundtrack that is most critical with any Ace Combat game, and 7 manages to deliver in spades. Longtime series composer Keiki Kobayashi returns along with other series veterans to produce a truly remarkable score. Just listen to this. I think it really sets the mood perfectly. Looking at the overall picture then, I think it's fair to say that Ace Combat 7 is mostly a success. The game itself is a phenomenal follow-up to the best games in the series. There's a lot of mission variety here, the core gameplay feels spot on, the atmosphere is pure Ace Combat, the soundtrack is on point, and it's gorgeous to boot. The only real issues I can leverage at the game stem from lesser performance on base consoles and lower than expected resolutions on PS4 Pro and Xbox One X. Oh, and the lack of ultra-wide monitor support on the PC. The rest of the presentation though is brilliant, and it's one of the most consistently beautiful games I've played in quite a while. The variety in scenery and quality of the rendering cannot be understated. It's a gorgeous game. Overall, Ace Combat 7 receives my highest recommendation then. Having spent time playing many of the earlier games in the series this week, this is the evolution I was looking for. The team understands the appeal of Ace Combat and sought to improve upon those core design tenets. Project Aces, the developer, resisted the open world craze, dodged the games as a service temptations, and stuck to their guns to produce a brilliant and complete experience, and I couldn't be happier with the results. It's definitely worth checking out. But that's all the time we have for today. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give us a like, subscribe to our YouTube channel, ring that notification bell up there, and follow us over on Twitter. And until next time, keep on soaring.